cloud because then Lizzie can put it on the YouTube channel. So I hope everybody's okay with that. Welcome to this evening's Organic Growers Alliance webinar, Living Mulch Experiments on 20 Farms in the Northeast US with me, Stephen Jacobs. I'm OGA coordinator, and our guest is Lincoln Fishman, who founded Momentum Ag in 2022 and has been farming in Western Massachusetts, it says here, Lincoln, for 15 years. You don't look old enough. Growing 5 acres of organic vegetables with occasional forays into beef, goats, pork, dairy, chicken, eggs, hemp, and maple syrup, apparently. So we will start. Lincoln will show us around, and then we can have a bit of a Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box, but I will be around even though my camera's off. If you need to field any, I can field any questions or whatever. Over to you, Lincoln.
That's great. So you'll keep an eye on the chat?
Yeah.
Great. And if anybody wants, I wish I could see your faces. There's so few of us.
Yeah, do feel free if you wish to turn on your camera. It's not
Oh, they
obligatory.
can. Okay, great. Well, I love it because then I can tell whether people are interested. But you can interrupt me at will because there won't be that many interruptions with this crowd.
No, that's true.
And so I'm just going to start. But yeah, any questions that come up. So here we've got a field of brassicas growing in a Dutch white clover living mulch. That was the clover was established the previous year, and then these transplants were set in, and I'll sort of talk about what it looks like and then a bunch of our results. Felt important to start here, which is what's our climate like versus yours, so that you can contextualize all this. So temperature wise, we are colder in the winter and hotter in the summer by quite a bit. And I don't have I just chose this because I think that's where OGA headquarters is, right? And Northampton, Massachusetts is fairly representative of where our trials are, but they go all the way up to northern Vermont and out into the Midwest and south into Connecticut and New York. So this is average for us, but there's actually a fair amount of variation. There's as much variation, I'd say, between these two warm points. In any case, just to give you a sense. And rainfall, we seem to get quite a bit more, at least than OGA headquarters does. Just kind of wanted to give you a reference point here. A little bit about me, and not a lot, because there's lots to say about all these other trials that are going on. My farm is called Sawyer Farm. It's up in the hills in Massachusetts. It's not mountains really, but it's all very sloped. Over the years, I would say our bread and butter is storage crops. So onions and carrots, potatoes, cabbage, stuff like that we sell year round because we do have these really long winters. Used to have snow cover. Now it's just cold enough that you can't grow anything. And so this is really all we have to market for 6 or more months out of the year. And it's very sloped, which is important because early on, and we farmed with draft horses for the first 12 years maybe, and we got a tractor, I think 3 years ago. It's hard to tell from this photo, but just everything is on a slope on the farm. And so we were doing everything we could to stop erosion. We had these raised beds sort of on contour that the horses would throw up. You can see we've already started to think about minimizing tillage in this photo, which is maybe 8 years old, something like that. Where the way that I learned how to be a good organic farmer was you want that perfect fine seed bed that's extremely uniform. And if that takes 10 passes to get there, that just shows that you're dedicated to doing a good job. So I'd starting to take some of these tillage reduction lessons to heart here. And I don't know if I'd done a light disking. It looks like nothing at all. And I was just sort of going to throw up these beds and then plant into them. And that's a winter kill cover of oats and peas. So the beds are on contour. We're growing cover crops. and we're reducing tillage, and it still wasn't enough. This isn't my farm, but it's representative. We would get heavy spring rains, but in particular right now, we're getting hurricanes. Hurricane season has just gotten much worse, and the frequency and the intensity have both increased over the last decade, and really dramatically over the last 5 or 6 years. Hurricanes start in the Gulf of Mexico, but in any case, they wind up moving basically up from Florida along the coast and dumping rain on us at the end of the season. And our rye cover crop that we were getting in at that time was just too small, inadequate to actually keep the soil intact. And so what we started doing was interseeding. That's how we got started with clover. Basically, after last cultivation, once we felt the ground was clean, we would go through and just broadcast with like a chest mounted spreader. We would broadcast clover into a variety of crops. We started with corn because that's done fairly frequently here, and so that would be sometime in July. It was around last cultivation, early July, and then we would kind of move through the other crops as we hit last cultivation. We ended up doing this on almost every crop in the field. There's alliums on the right, onions, other alliums as well, solanaceous crops, cucurbits, brassicas, really on everything except for crops that are in ground where there's just going to be a lot of disturbance when you remove them, like potatoes or carrots, and not on salad greens either, because you don't want clover leaves in your lettuce mix. And what we would do is we would interseed that clover. It would overwinter. It would start growing in the spring. Then we would plow it down, cultivate, 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 clean, 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 and then reestablish the clover. And after we'd done that, we've been doing that for many years. It started to feel a little crazy because we had clover growing, 9 months out of the year, and then we would kill it and reestablish, kill it and reestablish. And at some point, we asked, could we actually just grow crops in the clover living mulch? And I could find very little information about it. There were some university studies that were inconclusive. They were mostly focused on the benefits of the system from an ecological perspective, but almost no information about what a farmer cares about, which is timing and how you might change fertility and how you can change the balance there so that the clover and the cash crop has a symbiosis rather than antagonistic relationship. All these things I couldn't find them. And so we ended up just throwing in a few hundred cabbage transplants. And I remember when I took this photo because I thought, yeah, this is a stupid idea. Of course, it's not going to work. It's getting eaten by the clover. And I walked away and I didn't do any management. And then sometime in July or August, I was looking, I was thinking, these they might even make a head. And by harvest, they were totally equivalent to the cabbage planted in bare soil next to them in terms of head size. And I thought, I could have left. I could have planted, if I just had a cabbage farm, I could have planted these. We plant them in late June, and come back, mowed it once, and come back for harvest in October. If I had not been successful this first time, I don't think I would have stuck with it, because in the years that followed, as I tried to scale this, we had some successes, some failures, and figuring out the equipment was difficult. I'll talk a little bit about that. The spacings are different. There's just a lot to figure out. And I think I only stuck with it because I saw the promise of it from the very beginning. But I ended up really wanting there to be a community of people to talk to about this. And so we launched Momentum Ag. I don't say this to funders, but really so that I could have a group of friends to talk to about this system. And we do other trials at this point outside of clover living mulch, but the concept of each one of them is the same. I'll talk a little more about this later, but in general, it feels like there's usually on the left-hand side here an expert who tells a farmer what to do, and then you try to implement this new thing and you hit a barrier, it doesn't work, and you give up. And what Momentum's trying to do is on the right here, which is create a community where we can really work together to lift each other over that barrier. And so what that looked like, we've got 20 people signed up last year. They had gotten clover established in 2022 with us. They received trial payments. Not huge. It depends on how much they have, the size of the trial, the complexity of the trial, the number of trials. People are getting between $2,000 and $6,000 or $7,000 probably. So for the bigger farms that we work with, that's not a really significant amount of money. I think it's really more about the respect. But it does help pay for your time in collecting data and offset yield loss, which we're still experiencing in many of our trials. Most of the farmers are in New England. A couple are in the Midwest and Ontario. And these people are organic. For the most part, although we definitely have and encourage conventional farmers. That just is my background, and so I think it's sort of skewed towards organic vegetable people. But there's also silage, corn silage, for dairy mostly, small grains, and row crop growers, and we're 5 to 500 acres.
You okay, Lincoln? Looks like you're frozen. Oh, the joys of the internet. Ah, you're back.
Was I gone?
Sorry, you were frozen.
Oh,
Just for a minute.
should I continue?
Yeah, please. We'd not seen these, so if you go from the first time you started these slides.
Which slides? Oh, my screen sharing is paused. But why?
Looks
Are you seeing
fine from here.
You're seeing it?
Yep.
Great. Did you see this slide?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, Somehow, sorry everyone. There we go, I think. Okay. So you saw this. You heard me talk about that.
Yes.
Great. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown. This is an example of one of the farms that we work with, how they are implementing the system. So this clover was established the previous year. They mowed it low and then went through with this homemade strip tiller. So there's a lead straight coulter up front, a ripper tooth right here, and then two wavy coulters that are set off one another so that they can crumble the soil in that zone, but they don't get soil and residue caught in between the two of them. And it makes a neat little slot like you can see on the left here. So then in this case, they went through and planted tomatoes, transplanted tomatoes, and the control is on the left. And it's worth mentioning about our trials. The control is whatever the farmer wants it to be. It's their normal system. So we are not asking people to institute some control that represents a sort of ecological worst case scenario or whatever else. The control is what you do. In this case, the control is also very cool. It was a overwintering mix of rye and vetch, I think, that they crimped down and then covered with landscape fabric and similarly ripped through it with that same stripper. So that's a pretty groovy control as well. And here's what it looks like as we move through the season. It's worth just saying out loud, but it's even the landscape fabric isn't doing any work for our soil during the course of the season versus plants. And the quote at the end of the field was, "Clover brings happiness to our fields." One of the pieces of feedback I got from this farm in particular was that the crew really liked it. There's no mud, there's no dust, and you can put your harvest crate down wherever you want. And that was actually last year was their second year running tomato controls, and they got very equivalent yields both years. So what we're really asking with these trials, just to give you the bigger picture here, is it practical and scalable? And these are really like the management questions, right? And the equipment questions, the timing questions. And that's pretty much qualitative stuff that we gather, right? So it's like, how's it feel? The next set of questions is it profitable? and we can kind of measure that through yields, labor, and input. Um, and it's quantitative, but only kind of. Um, Labor is, as you know, is very, it's really difficult. First of all, it's difficult for people to keep good track of it anyway. So I have very few farms where I really trust those numbers at all. But when you're implementing a new system, it's slow and you make mistakes and you wouldn't do it the same way again. And so it turns out that tractor passes or hours spent in the field, no one's really ready to hang their hat on that yet. I think we would need to be 2, 3, 4 years into that before someone says, okay, well, this is my system for clover living mulch. And I can approach that with the same level of certainty that I approach plow, disc, harrow, you know, plant. And so at the moment, even in cases where there's more tractor passes in in a tilled system, um, those passes are easy, right? You know what you're doing. And the passes in clover are often slower, and you stop and start, you make some readjustments. So anyway, that's why I said kind of quantitative. And then the third thing we're doing is that we're verifying the soil health benefits in aggregate and individually, right? So we want to see that we're moving in the right direction as a group, but also that it holds up from farm to farm. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And again, I wrote it's kind of quantitative. You know, assessing soil health is still a field that's kind of in its infancy. And so we spend a lot of time wondering how accurate these numbers really are. Thought it was worth saying sort of Momentum's overall thought process, which is reflected in what we're looking at through those trials, is, and it starts from the bottom here, if ecosystem services are well documented and an adoption is anemic, then we empower farmer-led solutions to drive adoption. And these clover living mulch trials are the most robust trials we're running at the moment, and they fit perfectly into this framework, which the services have been very well documented at the university level since the 1980s. There's 0% adoption. I mean, a handful of farmers, but I'm going to call it 0%. So we ask, how do we make it practical, profitable, and scalable? And we also fund farmers, in addition to the trials funding, they can get funding to go talk about their results at a conference or mentor a neighbor or host a field walk, something like that, to drive adoption. So we tracked 47 trials last year. Many farms ran multiple trials. And we lost data on about 8 of them. It was acts of God or, for whatever reason, we just don't have any data at all there. 70% of farmers said that their trial was successful. I was surprised that it was that high, having visited everybody. But people weren't thinking about success using any one metric. And so this was just an interesting thing for me that emerged. These were the terms that came up most when people talked about their trial and whether it was successful or not. So we have labor profitability and yield up here, and these are the things that we think about normally when we talk about, is this a successful technique? There was also a lot of talk, certainly among, well, no, across the board, people talking about weeds, and this was cut in both directions. I had fewer weeds in the system, or I had more weeds in the system. There are some people who have fully 100% clean fields, and it's harder to keep clover 100% clean. On the other hand, if you just struggle with weeds all season long and that's sort of your baseline and your norm, clover's doing a lot of weed suppression. So there were two really different takeaways there, but that was a very important topic, no surprise to a lot of people. Complexity was like, some people liked that they were trying something new. It's exciting to them. That's what they want to be doing. And other people were like, oh my God, I can't believe I took on one more thing. My life is already crazy. I don't know how to do this exactly. And I don't have the mental bandwidth to be taking this on. Soil health and values and community. I think these three things are connected too. And they came up a lot for folks also, where it was like, oh, I've never had a community to talk to about this. And that in itself is worth something. I didn't need this to be successful from a profit perspective. I just wanted to be engaged in this work with other people. Or, I'm a large scale organic farmer. I've been trying to reduce tillage and I've had no luck at all until now. And even though this isn't, all the kinks aren't worked out of this system, I feel that it has more promise than anything I've tried so far. Or, when I reach my hand into the soil underneath the clover, I feel that I'm doing the right thing. So anyway, that's what success means, just to be clear. Here's an example of a real failure. There's no question. No two ways about it. I like to show it off because we're still at we're at the warts and all stage here. So this farmer put coulters out front of a yeoman plow to rip kind of a slot, and then followed along with a water wheel transplanter. This is what her squash looked like on June 20th. Um, this is the squash. It's really hard to see. Totally flaccid in the clover living mulch and completely fine in the bare soil. She irrigated the clover in the living mulch shortly after that, and it popped right back. It was very unusual weather for that time of year. It was 100 degrees, which is probably 25 degrees above normal for that time of year. So it's 38 Celsius that day. And we don't know if here we've got bare soil, and on the right hand, we've got the living mulch. Um, and it just continued to be horrible all season long. And the clover kind of petered out here. Not successful. The trials to date have mostly been leaning in the direction of what we call zippered, kind of no-till, as little disturbance as possible, and just sort of inserting the transplant or the large seeded direct seeded crop right into the clover. Partially to minimize disturbance, but also just to keep weeds away, and get the clover right up next to the plants. That's been most of our trials. Last year, a number of people wanted to do strip trials, and that's on the right-hand side. So we call it zip versus strip. The width of the strips varied. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the ones in this photo are about 12 or 14 inches wide. And this was another winter squash trial. So they made the strip initially with a large strip tiller unit, a large scale strip tiller unit. But then they kind of made those strips nicer, and phone call. Don't worry, I'm not getting it. I'm gonna hang up. They essentially stale bedded those strips 4 or even 5 times before planting the winter squash, and then only had a single cultivation event after planting, and no mowing occurred after planting. So this is sort of winter squash at the other end of the success spectrum. There's no question this was a successful trial. You can see, the weeds and the that kind of like packed soil surface here on the right in the control versus the clover on the left. I'm cutting out a bunch of photos, but it did very nicely. I included this whole text from the farmer because this is exactly what I like to get. It captures that quantitative and that qualitative aspect. And they played the math out for me right here, so I felt like I was comfortable with it too. We can see the conclusion here is 17,500 pounds per acre in the control versus, so we had higher yields in the clover. There was no hand weeding in the strip till. This is a larger scale farm where a crew of farm hands will go out, and it's an extremely expensive event to send a dozen people out to weed. So avoiding that was very important for this farmer. And they had about the same number of tractor passes. Here's a third method that's worth mentioning, I thought, for this group. Not knowing exactly what everybody's scales are, this is a smaller scale, and this couple's putting down a very thick band of compost on the planting strip. No mowing, no touching the soil at all. The transplant actually gets set into the compost, and they keep the water running because compost, will get really dry and hydrophobic if you don't keep it moist. They wait until they feel that the crop has rooted out and down. They mow only if needed for weed emergence through the clover over the course of the season. So I think they did it once or maybe twice. And it's worked for everything they've tried. I think, when you give that much juice to the system in terms of that much compost right there in the rooting zone where your cash crop can really get established strongly, we don't see that antagonistic relationship develop, and both the clover and the cash crop seems to be doing really well. I don't think this could be scaled up because of the quantity of compost, but I think it's very interesting, you know, in the 5-acre range, let's say, or below. When we look at the zip versus strip next to each other, just one set of results versus the other, only 60% of zip trials were successful versus 90% of strip trials. And I think that makes sense, first of all, just in terms of competition between the clover and the cash crop, right? But it also means that our equipment, which is meant to operate in bare soil, is operating in bare soil within that strip. So transplanting, direct seeding, whatever else, we're not trying to modify the ground engaging equipment as much in the strip system. And so I think we're just getting better root ball to soil contact, seed to soil contact. It's easier to incorporate fertilizer. So at this point, we're definitely leaning in a strip direction. And then on the other hand, I keep feeling like I want to point out to people 60% of the zip trials were successful. It's not time to give up. I think they're really interesting, and the zip offers a lot of benefits when it works well. There's very, very little management that occurs. And so I don't want to walk away from either of these, and I'm happy to see that we're exploring more directions, and there's even more directions than this, and I'll talk about that later. So what were our best management suggestions coming out of, we call them, usually it'd be called best management practices. We weren't even ready to say that. It's best management suggestions that we all put together as a group during a big long winter meeting, a day-long session we had in January. So first of all, start with a good stand of clover. If there's perennial weeds in that clover, it's just not a good bet that it's going to work. Most perennial weeds, grasses, or thistles are really aggressively foraging for nutrients. They tend to get tall and offer some photosynthetic competition to your cash crop. Starting with a good stand feels like maybe the most important piece. Ensure adequate nutrients. You're growing two crops in your field. You're growing the clover and you're growing your cash crop. The clover doesn't really need extra nitrogen, right? But it does need, you need to have all of your nutrients in an abundance that means that both crops can get what they need without fighting between one another. And this is a little wishy-washy, but I really feel like when the clover and the cash crop can look around at the soil nutrient profile and not feel threatened, they will actually work together and we'll get a symbiotic effect. And when they look around and it's clear that there's some scarcity in the system, antagonism kicks in immediately. I don't have slides about this, but something I've been thinking a lot about because there's more dynamics going on here than just an interaction between two species. But enough said about that for now, unless people want to talk about it later. Whoops, sorry. We used to think that mowing as frequently as possible was good. Again, actually, this ties into that antagonism piece. We now think that when you hurt the clover in that way, it responds aggressively by trying to sequester more nutrients and regrow into into a vegetative state. When we don't mow it, we allow it to move normally through its life cycle, in which its growth starts to slow as it enters a reproductive state. It's putting more energy into seeds. It's kind of hanging out and not doing a lot. That's what it likes to do over the course of the warmer, drier months. And then we see it rebound in fall when we don't really care. Our cash crops are big and well developed at that point. So we're only mowing immediately before transplanting or emergence or seed emergence in zip only. You don't need to do this in strip. Again, if needed for photosynthetic competition in zip. Again, this is not an issue in strip. And if needed for weeds in both systems, if we see that annual weeds are emerging through the clover canopy at some point in the season. We tend to see that happening again as the clover growth slows in July or August. A lot of these annual weeds are actually germinating underneath the clover, but there's just not enough light to get them to go. They are not designed um, they have not evolved to germinate in low light, heavy moisture conditions. They really are meant to operate in disturbed ground. And because the ground underneath there is not disturbed, we don't see as much emergence. And what does emerge tends to be really spindly and weak. But a few months later, if the clover is senescing a little bit and there's some openings in the canopy, sometimes we'll see these annual weeds shoot up really quickly. So anyway, we're doing as little mowing as possible at this point. Early irrigation is really nice. A lot of our farmers don't have irrigation and it's not an option. When we do, the only time we're really seeing moisture competition, we think, is early on. Even if soil moisture looks adequate, it can often be beneficial to add more right around the root zone of the cash crop. And again, we're growing two crops, right? Normally, whatever soil moisture is in tilled ground is fully available to your cash crop. It's only going to leave the field through evaporation. In this system, the clover's root network is everywhere. And so it has the ability to draw water out wherever it cares to. Oh, there's stuff in the chat. Should I be paying attention to that? Sorry.
I'll keep an eye on it. It's a question. If you carry it on, and then unless you want to answer questions on the fly.
I do.
Okay, so Josie's asking, was there a noticeable increase in animal or pollinator activity in the fields with clover? And was this beneficial or unhelpful?
Such a good question. That's great. So noticeable, yes. And one of the things when I was starting this system at Sawyer Farm, just to give people a sense of how different these two things were, I would have people at the beginning of the season, I'm talking about, interns or farm workers, just sit in the clover for 5 minutes. And for the first minute or two, it's very boring and they don't know why I'm asking them to do this. And then you look more closely and there's bees everywhere. There are spiders crawling through there. There's lots of insects you've never seen before. As you look, it's this sort of seething landscape of life. And then you have to go sit in the bare soil for 5 minutes, and it's deeply boring. There is truly nothing to look at. You can't keep your mind occupied for 5 minutes sitting and staring at a patch of dirt. And so, just on a sort of qualitative basis, it is 100% different between the two. In general, we see less pest pressure and disease in the clover living mulch. It's really hard to quantify because it varies so much from farm to farm and season to season. But the obvious things are, in terms of pests, we have a lot of pest predators that can live in the clover. For you guys, the clover is actually a native plant. For us, it's nativized, so it's been here for a couple hundred years, and there are pest predators that have evolved to live in it. Um, so I think that's an important piece of what's going on is just building a more complex ecosystem where, when we just have crops in bare soil or on plastic, we are sort of asking for imbalance, for pest imbalance, right? We're saying like, if only the only reason for you to come here is if you want to eat these plants. Most pest predators don't travel very far from their home base to access food sources. So just a couple 100 feet would be the maximum generally. These are small creatures, right? And when we can create habitat that they can live in that is directly adjacent to the cash crop, we're seeing a lot of those benefits. And the one exception is slugs. Because clover is also a really nice home for slugs, the soil is cooler and moister. We've not had it cause serious marketable damage, but it has caused a lot of concern over the course of the season. And I get photos that I don't like to see and the grower doesn't like to see. But we've not had it rise to a terrible level. And then, we see more of everything else that you would expect sort of up the food chain. One thing we were really worried about was moles and voles and mice in this system because they have cover. but we've not seen an uptick in those populations, and I can't tell you why. I don't know. Let's see. Did that answer the question, do you think? Was there a second piece to it? I'm not seeing.
That was pretty good. Josie's responded. Really interesting. Thanks.
Okay, great. I love questions, so keep them coming. I feel funny just talking and talking for forever without um more input. Um, the other piece for people who are
I've got another question if you want.
let's do it.
So Mark is asking, have you noticed any increase in mycorrhizal fungi within the soil?
Um, so observationally, yes, because when you take a shovel, you can often see that it's going on. I don't know if you guys have tests that you like. I the testing that we have for fungal versus bacterial ratios and total quantities is incredibly expensive. And I've not found the right grant to match actually doing that testing. Um, and not only is it expensive, but I think it's young, and so it's difficult. It's even if we had positive results, I would still be taking them with a grain of salt because these tests are pretty new. I will show you some soil health results shortly. I think a couple slides from now, I have soil health results, but they're more on things like respiration. They're not specifically about fungi. They're about overall activity, biological activity in the soil. But and then I guess the last thing to say on that is there is a lot of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi research coming out of Japan. This guy named Deguchi, who is specifically looking at phosphorus release that's made possible, and this is in organic grain corn. Um, the the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are forming associations with the corn roots very rapidly because they're pre-existing in the soil in association with the clover. They then jump to the corn and make a tremendous amount of phosphorus available. And that's borne out in our um, soil health results as well, but only by measuring phosphorus. So not directly by saying, well, this is why that's happening, but it's a decent theory given what the university research is telling us.
Thank you. Good answer.
The last piece here is just healthy transplants and good soil contact. Um, Healthy transplants always matter, but again, with this framework of um, a relationship that can slide from symbiosis to antagonism, really based on what the overall nutrients are and what the health of both plants is. Um, I think it's particularly important in this system to be using healthy transplants. And the same, I should have put it on here, but large, healthy seeds with good germination. There's been a lot written about the sort of degradation of seed health over the last many decades. Um, Choosing beautiful seeds makes a difference too. And I actually had two side-by-side varieties of black turtle beans. This is for dry beans. So they're both called black turtle beans. One was a juicy, plump, shiny seed. That was one lot. And the other lot was much smaller and had a sort of dusty seed coat look to it. They both came up. It was clear from the beginning, though, that those seeds that were larger and lovelier were producing bigger plants. And that was really borne out all season long and at the end of the season in terms of yield. So this is the personification that I'm referencing at the bottom of the page. I think when a bean plant comes up and is healthy and vigorous and ready to grow, if I'm the clover living next to it, I think, okay, you're not going to attract pests. You're probably going to encourage different fungal and bacterial associations than I could do alone as a single species. And I don't want to fight with you because you can probably punch back. And so let's figure out a way to make this work between the two of us. I'm really talking, this is a little crazy, and I tend not to say um in a not scientific way. But I don't know. I don't know how to measure these things, and I just feel like this is what I am seeing as I'm walking through all these fields. So anyway, The
That's
second piece
fascinating. I
is
like
good
the way
soil.
you're speaking about it. We've got another question. Paulina's asked, how do you apply the nutrients before planting the cabbage in the zip and in the strip?
Great question. Ideally, we are putting the nutrients underneath the soil surface in both cases. And so what that looks like in zip is a double disc opener with a fertilizer applicator tube, either dry or liquid, that's able to put it subsurface, next to where the plant is growing. Most people we're working with don't have that equipment, and they're just surface applying the nutrients. It seems to work, but we think that some of it is wasted. Clover will eat free nitrogen if it can. It makes nitrogen when nitrogen is in short supply. And so when we put it right at the surface, we're encouraging those shallow clover roots to sort of grab it first. And any disturbed soil, also, when you have high nitrogen levels in the soil, you tend to get weed flushes that are more intense. So we don't love it, but that's mostly what we're doing, and it's been working. Everyone has their own theory about how to dial back fertility rates. Most people are calculating their fertility rates at a per acre basis and broadcasting, not in clover living mulch, excuse me, but in their normal system, would be broadcasting nutrients fairly evenly over an entire field to start the season, planting, and then side dressing. So in this case, people are reducing their fertilizer by some amount, usually somewhere in the 30 to 50% range, and focusing that fertility right around the cash crop. So in a maybe 8 or 12-inch band around the cash crop. That's in zip. In strip, we have the ability to and just focusing all those drop tubes on the
Sorry,
strip.
then can you just froze for could you say that again? You just froze
Oh,
for a
I'm
few
sorry.
seconds.
In strip, we have, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Um, in strip, we do have the ability to incorporate the fertilizer. So for organic folks, um, that's a hopper with an auger, and usually it's coming down into some drop tubes, and we just sort of focus the drop tubes on the strip and then use a cultivating tractor to work it in. Um, I mean, there are just so many different fertilizer application, pieces of equipment to do that job that it's a conversation with every single farmer. Like, what do you have and what's that plan going to look like? Um, and steering is maybe the biggest issue, is just actually getting it where it's supposed to go. Can be a little bit tricky depending on if it's 3 point and it's behind you, it can be quite a trick to make sure that it's falling where it's supposed to be.
I've got a sort of supplementary question. Mark's asked, given compost is expensive, as you mentioned, but has good results, Mark's asking, could composted wood chip be used as a cheaper option, perhaps for larger plots?
Absolutely. I think we would still have an application issue for larger scales, which is how do we get it down on the ground in this thick band? And I have seen people build plywood hoppers on the back of their manure spreader to kind of focus the flow into a band. Um, we would then, I think, have an issue of, okay, how do we put transplants into that band efficiently? Um, but you're absolutely right. It's cheaper, and I think we would get a lot of the same benefits in terms of we're inoculating with something that's very alive, and we are suppressing the clover right in that zone where the competition can be most intense. But we would need to think through how we moved through that composted wood chip material. I mean, depending on how composted it is, I guess if it's a very fine material already, no problem at all. But if it's coarse, how do we cut through that?
Excellent. Thank you.
think I'm done with this slide, right? Yeah. So then species selection is very important. Um, and uh, I've not included my own results from Sawyer Farm here, but I can do that as we move through, but they align in many ways. So for Zip, um, we did we've all the tomato trials have been successful so far. And last year, 6 out of 7 brassica trials were successful. Um, when I say successful, this is me applying a much higher bar for success than the farmers did. So I'm really talking about trials where yields were equivalent, or very close to equivalent, that any farmer would walk by and say, like, wow, that's great. That looks like it's doing just the same as the one over here. Where, as I said before, the kind of the bar graph I showed with success included a lot of folks who had more significant yield loss or some weeds in there, whatever the thing was, but they still called it success. So these ones are more strictly successful. um, Hemp, I am the only person who's done trials. I've done it at 2 different farms one that we lease and one at the home farm, and I've done it for 4 years maybe in living clover, and I wouldn't do it any other way because there's no work. It's just a crop that gets along really well with the clover. And when you're growing hemp, it's this very small plant. They're 5 feet apart on center in every direction. Um, there's bare soil for most of the season. Um, it's just awful. This way I get to plant the hemp, leave, and come back in September to harvest it. And dry beans are another one where I think it's only me, one other farm that's had luck with dry beans, but I'm putting a question mark there because it's not, I don't feel ready to say like, yeah, that one works. Um, Strip, it was clear that there was a benefit. So we had successful zip trials with squash, with corns, with beans, and with some other crops. But there was some variation there. And so at this point, if someone says to me, hey, I want to grow winter squash in a clover living mulch, I say, why don't you start with strip? Not because zip can't work, but because I'd like you to be successful. And what seems true is that we're having close to 100% success if we just make a strip. Yeah, these were other suggestions that all of us were talking about at the meeting, which is, as we're trying to problem solve here, like you have to either think like a plant or pretend that they think like us. Um, and patience is a huge piece of this. I mean, for all of us, there's times when we walk through our fields at different times of year and just feel really despairing. Um, and over the years, you learn to temper that and do what you can, but try not to freak out when things aren't looking exactly how you'd like them to look. And patience is a part of this. The soil temperatures are a little cooler underneath the clover. I think that competition is real, and we see things just move a little more slowly early season. Um, and again, sort of being involved in these trials means if it's not fully successful, you can afford to be curious. Like that's actually, I would, in many cases, and hope that your experience means that somebody else doesn't have to make that same mistake. This is what I see as the real barriers we're facing still at the moment, which is beyond crop selection. There's a fair amount of variation in how varieties do. And as an example, another bean example for me at my farm, I grew 2 varieties of pole beans for green beans, and one of them did beautifully in clover living mulch, and one of them was pretty poor. And if I had just grown that one variety that didn't do that well, I would have said, I don't really think direct seeded um, whole green beans work in this system. But the fact that I did two means I do believe that it can work. And also, unfortunately, it means that there's hundreds of varieties of green beans. And it's like a lifetime of work. So just contemplating how we eventually do that variety um, assessment by variety feels a little daunting right now, but well worth the effort. Um, and then this other piece, are we aiming to minimize labor primarily or maximize clover suppression? And this is the zip strip um, dilemma here, but there are other places that it comes into play too, where, okay, would I rather put it in zip, walk away, and take a 20% yield hit because I'm really aiming for a low management system? Or would I rather do everything, be kind of irritated because I'm figuring out how to make and maintain this strip, but I've got a lot of suppression going on there and I feel confident in what my yields are going to be? I don't actually know if this belongs on the barriers to success slide now that I'm saying it out loud. This is a slide from a talk a while ago. I don't know if it's a barrier. I think it's just a consideration. It's sort of like, who are you as a grower? What matters to you? What's your risk tolerance, and what do you see as most important for your farm? And then, of course, again, just this season to season variability and farm to farm variability means that I think what it means to work this system out is pretty amorphous at this point. Um, I think we could get it working really, really nicely at 70% of our farms. And it would then be our job to really figure out, like, okay, what was the difference between those farms and the ones that didn't work if we want to see other people adopt it so that it feels like a real system with parameters around how to do it and be successful. But the reason I chose this photo for this particular slide is um, our current system is a wreck. Like, let's not judge Clover Living Mulch or any of these other great systems too harshly, right? The bare field on the right is a disaster. It's just the devil we know. And so we accept horrific yield losses. We accept erosion and dead soil, and viewed through a different frame. If we were fully unwilling to have those potential issues crop up, um, then why not try something new? Um, I've got a I've got a child bouncing a basketball next to my truck. Um, Okay, equipment is a major issue as well. So mechanical transplanting into no-till mechanical transplanting, forget about clover living mulch, just in general, is fussy. Um, you have to get on and off the tractor. You have to really take a look at whether it's doing what you want it to do and whether the furrow is being nicely closed. And if you're damaging your root ball too much, there's a lot there. The mowing options are limited. So people are using um, push behind mowers or mowers on two-wheel tractors or weed whackers, little modified sickle bar mowers, and then larger scale. I should have had a picture here. One guy welded four Honda lawnmowers onto a big 7x7 bar, and you pull start each of the four of them, and when you set it down, they run in between the row crops. Uh, but this is something that we're going to need to continue working on, and we're working with some folks who do robotics because this actually is a solvable problem at this point, but no one wants to invest in it because it doesn't apply to very many acres right now. The strip maintenance in organic requires some fussing as well. It's not terrible, but you may need some different cultivating attachments or just have your setup look a little bit different so that you can actually keep that strip weed free. And that person who asked a question about fertility application, it requires some real thinking through prior to the season. But the promise here is to reduce labor and increase profitability. And it really embodies the four principles of soil health. Is everybody talking about this in the UK? I feel like in the last few years, everyone's like, the four principles of soil health. Or there's five principles. One is animal integration, but mostly you hear people talk about the four principles. So I did want to spend a minute. What time is it? 3 o'clock.
Yeah,
I think we're
well, it's 8 o'clock here. You're okay. So we're here for another half an hour. We can take more questions, but you can keep going. That's fine.
I think folks will be interested in this based on the questions that popped up, but absolutely keep throwing questions in the chat, and I'm happy to be interrupted. This is something we call it's the cash test. It's through Cornell University. It's one of the more sophisticated soil health tests that's out there. Um, could you mob stock sheep instead of mowing? I think that you could. Yeah, I think that would be great.
There
We
was John Pawsey did it with cereals in East Anglia in Suffolk. Mixed success, but yeah, you get. I mean, it helped.
So for small grains, did he already have the small grain seeded and they were grazing both at the same time?
Yeah, I think they were.
Yeah. So I can see the benefit and the promise there, but of course they're also eating the new growing shoots of
Yeah,
your
for sure.
small grain.
Yeah, there's a
And
yield penalty.
in most of the situations we're talking about, that would happen prior to the crop being planted. And so I think
Mm.
it would only be to the benefit of the next crop to really graze that low, get some manure on the ground, get some hooves on the ground. Um, the Dutch white clovers that we're using are low growing, so there's not a tremendous amount of food. Um, but it's significant and it's extremely high quality. Um, so these are the results of the Cornell test, and you can see what they look at down here along the x-axis: water capacity, aggregate stability, organic matter, soil protein, respiration. Respiration is they take the soil sample, they put it in a chamber for I think 72 hours, it might be a week, and they see basically how much CO2 gets emitted off of that soil sample, which is an indication of how many living, breathing things are living in that soil.
My Lincoln frozen again. Sorry.
Biological activity overall.
Sorry, you
And
froze. You were just telling us about the respiration and the living, breathing things.
yeah, okay, great. Sorry. Um, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Um, So they're measuring the amount that the soil biology respires over the course of a few days. I can't remember right now. I was just told and I forget. So a soil with a lot of biology in it will emit a lot of CO2. And the reverse is true as well, which is a dead soil basically isn't breathing, and so you'll see very little CO2. Active carbon is a measure of that portion of the soil carbon which is in a very biologically available form. And again, it's sort of an indication of how much biological activity, how much um, immediately available food is there for the biology in that soil. So it would be more like how much food is in your kitchen pantry versus can you drive to the supermarket, right? So it's looking at overall carbon availability is interesting, but the active carbon is really like what's available as food right now. And the rest of these are more normal nutrients that you'd see in a standard soil test. And it looks like clover living mulch didn't have an effect really on those categories, but I'll show you later that it's more complicated. These central pieces from organic matter through active carbon, where we're seeing these big gains, is really about biology. Oh, and it's really, really important to say that these tests are not over time. They're taken at the same time in clover living mulch versus control. So we don't know where we started, but we know how we've diverged over the course of a season. And the reason we chose to do this is because the biology naturally has an ebb and flow over the course of the season that is predictable in terms of the overall curve, but very unpredictable from season to season based on how warm it is and how wet it is. So to say we started here and we ended here is not particularly interesting because we would expect to see major variations in biological activity between spring and early fall. So we thought it was more useful to say, okay, these two soils were treated differently over the course of an entire season. How do they look same day when we sample them at the end of the season? And so what we really see here is that the biggest measurable differences are all in terms of the amount of biology living in the clover living mulch, which is no surprise. Now this last slide is all of our controls and all of our CL, pairs of each held up next to each other. But as I said in the beginning, a lot of the controls are pretty groovy. A lot of the farmers we work with are already doing very cool things. And so we saw gains even over those systems, but it gets more dramatic when we look at farms who had a tilled control, where we saw really huge gains, or bigger gains in general, and particularly with aggregation, of course, because in one case they beat the soil up a bunch of times before they planted, and in the case of clover living mulch, they didn't. So another question we wanted to ask, because we care about overall trends, but we're a farmer-led organization. We want to know, is this working for every going to see these results, or is this just true in aggregate? And so we were pleased to see that the results really held steady from farm to farm. So what you're looking at here, each rectangle represents a pair of tests from one farm. So in this farm, they got a rating, and this is just respiration, right? How much biology is in there. They got a rating of 90 something versus 70 something. And we see that this pattern holds all the way down. We have one inverse test here, and this one was actually that failed squash trial I showed you. And we don't know if this happened because the squash failed, or if there was some underlying difference between the control, pre-existing soil difference between the control and the clover living mulch. But it makes us feel confident to say, yes, you see biology increase every single time. We can't say exactly by how much, but it's true. Versus, for example, organic matter, which we know take longer to build in the soil. And again, we were pleased to see that the clover living mulch was coming out on top in most cases, but it's less dramatic and less uniform. So these nutrients that look like they're flat, this is just because of I don't want to get into it, but the way that they rate nutrients in this test basically is asking, is this nutrient at an adequate level for plants to perform well? And in general, we have farmers who are doing a good job managing their soils, and the answer was yes. So you get a high rating. But when we looked at the actual value, so not like, are you telling us that you think it's adequate, but what's the actual pounds or ppms of these individual nutrients, we were much higher in clover living mulch pretty much across the board. So we had 25% more K, 28%, more P, 28K moving along. And the one that we see that's really dramatic that I tell people about a lot is sulfur. Clover is very hungry for sulfur. Sulfur is the thing that actually enables it to fix nitrogen. And so it holds in its living tissue about 15 ppms of sulfur per acre. And so we need to make sure that we have an overabundance of sulfur when we go into a trial year. So I'd like to see at least 20 to 30 ppms available sulfur after the clover is already established, because that lets me know, even if the clover is going to eat a little bit more sulfur over the course of the season, there will be adequate levels for the cash crop. On some of these other micros, it was a little less clear. We then did a CO2 equivalency based on the additional carbon that we observed in the clover living mulch trials. And the number was so crazy that we didn't believe it. This is the equation. I'm not going to get into it, but I ran it a number of different times trying to get the number lower. We kept coming out with 9,000 to 12,000 pounds more carbon. This is CO2 equivalent. CO2 equivalent means the weight of the carbon atom itself added to the weight of 2 oxygen atoms. which is basically to say how much CO2 isn't in the atmosphere. So it's the equivalent of sequestering 9 to 12,000 pounds of CO2 per acre in the CLM. That's like not burning 500 gallons of diesel per acre. And I really think there's something wrong with this number. Like, it's too good. But I don't know. I've showed this to lots of people who know a lot more than me and who are not able to poke holes in the math. So we'll keep watching um, whether this continues to be true. But I think what we can confidently say is that the clover living mulch is putting lots of carbon in the soil relative to all the other systems that our farmers are using. So what do I rate the system at this point in time as really high for soil health benefits, which isn't a surprise. University research has been showing this, but we want to show that it happens on real farms. And I'm giving it a low still for practicality, profitability, and scalability. Not because it's failing across the board. I think we've been through it, and I'm feeling pretty positive about it. But we're not at a point, and I don't think anyone's going to walk away from this call and say, well, great, this system sounds great, and I'll just put my whole farm into clover living mulch next year. That's where we need to get. We need to get to the point that someone who's not heard about this is so intrigued and the results are so sort of solid. We've worked out each of these pieces and we understand the levers we can pull to be successful with high reliability, that someone is willing to really adopt this. And we just had our first couple farms this year move a whole section of their production into the clover living mulch system. So I think that feels like the first vote of confidence. Having said that, no one's covering their entire farm in clover living mulch yet. We're just not there. So other things that are worth mentioning is, historically when I've talked about clover living mulch, it's planting a cash crop into established low growing clover. What we've found through these trials is that there are so many interesting variations, so many places to take this, and it really exists on a spectrum. That definition doesn't capture what it is. There's a big project going on based at Iowa State, and they call it PGC, perennial ground cover. And they're using Kentucky bluegrass in conventional, large scale Iowa grain corn operations. And they suppress the Kentucky bluegrass with herbicide and then grow the corn in it. That's part of what we're talking about too, right? I mean, when this world gets really big and there's lots of us in it, I might not talk to them quite as much as I do now. But the truth is we're thinking about a lot of the same stuff. And so these pieces in green are where our trial started. It was with Zip, with into an existing clover stand, with a cash crop and white clover. And it was actually Dutch white clover. But we are increasingly playing with all these other variables too. So the strip till I talked about, at some point, what's the difference between a strip till and a living pathway, which is a technique that lots of people are using? Well, it's really just about how many inches wide your strip is. So maybe we want to make these 16-inch strips or 30 inches. How, those two kind of meet one another conceptually. And so thinking about that strip width is very interesting. And we're keeping track of what widths different people are using and starting
Well,
to
I
talk.
was going to jump in there if I may.
Yeah,
We've got a
please.
question. Joe has asked exactly that. What width are we talking with the strips generally? And
Mhm.
could there be something between zip and strip to reduce fuss in terms of sort of smaller, tighter strip system? But
Yeah,
would this work, Joe asked, for crops like squash?
great question. So, um, in general, the strips that we're talking about are in this 10 to 14-inch range. And that's mostly because that's what strip till equipment is, more or less. And so, we're trying to use things that exist when we do that. Having said that, we have plenty of people who are taking tines off of rototillers to build a strip that's the width that they want, that's much wider than that, up to 30 inches even, which for me feels a little more like a living pathway. Um, and so we've got all that kind of stuff in between. The reason we don't love a strip less than, let's say, 8 or 10 inches is because you get weeds in that strip and you need room to operate a cultivator to remove those weeds. And if you've got clover really tight and your cash crop is right here, there's just not a lot of space to work loose soil and kill weeds. And so it seems like if we're not going to go, close to zero, and zip still isn't zero because we've got a coulter and a ripper. And so there is a band of disturbance that's, 2 or 3 inches, but we're hoping it's small enough that the clover quickly canopies over the that little disturbed slot we've made. If we open it up enough that the clover is not going to canopy quickly, we've got weeds in there and we need to manage them. And so what we've found is that if it's really narrow, it's just very difficult to get in there with cultivation equipment and work it. But yeah, I'm having really interesting conversations with folks. When you open this up to the living pathway world, there's a lot of people who have been working with that for a long time and have a lot of really interesting information about how to manage the edge, and are interested in the concept of like, oh, I don't actually don't know why, like, right, why is that my bed width? Like, um, what is the reason for that? Usually it's just because that's the distance between their tractor tires, or that's the piece of equipment they use to prep those beds. Um, but could we make it narrower and get the same production out of it, and open up more of the field for permanent cover?
And just quickly, while we've got you, Mark said he missed the bit at the beginning. How long have these trials been running for? And Mark comments it can take 4 years or more to start seeing the benefits at a scale that will convince farmers to do this across their farm. So how long has momentum been going?
We're about 3 years old, and m mostly people were getting clover established in 2023, and so most of our results came in last year in 2024, but we did have a number of people who had established clover in 2023 and ran trials then. I've been doing this at my farm. It's amazing that I can never remember. I think since 2019. And so I have lots of data from that one place, but it's specific soil and equipment, and that was the real motivation to get this out onto other farms. And you're right. Okay, so I think people see the benefit, like those soil health tests that I was showing you, that that divergence happened over the course of a single growing season, right? So the soil health benefits we see immediately or close to immediately, relative to, let's say, cover cropping, which can often take longer to improve a soil. Um, in terms of seeing the benefit, I think again, it's really about these barriers, like overcoming these barriers. So the reason someone wouldn't adopt it at scale right now is we just don't have it all worked out. If somebody told me they wanted to convert their 500-acre, um, you know, corn and bean operation to clover living mulch next year, I would say, please don't. let's let's talk about a 5 or 10 acre trial. I hope that you feel confident enough, that I feel confident enough, for you to do that a couple years from now. But that's not where the system is right now. Uh, I don't think. But as we gather all these data points, and this coming season will be another 50 trials. Um, I think we'll start to have some real information. And as you say, yeah, somebody who's experienced success multiple years in a row will be ready to take a bigger leap and invest in the equipment that's necessary to scale this. Like, again, a lot of this is they're not making the equipment we need. And so a lot of it requires some modification. And even for folks who can see their way around what that would look like, what that ideal solution would look like, are you ready to spend $5,000 or $25,000 to get yourself there? So the width of the strip is sort of about space, right? How do we manage this in space? There's also how do we manage this in time? So as I said, we've been going into existing clover, but we certainly bleed into the interseeding world a lot, and I speak about interseeding a lot, and I speak to other people about their interseeding experiences a lot. It's a really nice way to get the clover established for living mulch the following year. But these aren't fully different techniques. They're quite related. And what's in between the two is same season establishment of clover. And in general, I've been discouraging this because it's hard to get clover established quickly enough to have it suppress weeds fully in the same year. But what we're doing this year, what a lot of people are doing this year, this wasn't my idea. This was one of the people that we work with. Um, he had a small scale experiment 2 years ago where he tarped a winter killed cover. I I think it was Ryan Vetch, or he rolled it down. He tarped it for a couple weeks. He took the tarp off, broadcast clover seed over the whole thing, and then transplanted um, Brussels sprouts into this block. And the clover came up beautifully, occupied all the spaces in the residue as the rye and vetch was breaking down. And it looked like a true living mulch trial, or it looked like interseeding by time the Brussels were, maybe 12 inches tall. And we thought, well, that's really interesting because now you don't, it's a way to, it's not interseeding. It happened, I mean, it is interseeding. It's also living mulch. It's somewhere in between. And I think he just broke the wall for me in thinking about timing. And so this year, a number of people have frost seeded clover into overwintering rye. Some of them will harvest that rye and plant the next crop um, into the clover. Most of them are going to crimp the rye down on top of the clover, suppress the clover with that crimped rye, plant cash crops into that, and then let the clover come up and occupy the gaps in the rye. And for us in our cold climate, it's very difficult to get enough rye biomass to crimp it down and suppress weeds season long. And so we don't have a lot of roller crimping happening in the Northeast and running across.
So can I ask a question? Because this is something that I worked on years ago. It was about roller crimping, and people in Britain generally don't go for it because the winters are not cold enough. You don't get you don't get that suppression. Things pop back up all too readily.
Weeds do, you mean?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and the rye. So if you're using the rye as a kind of cover crop, and actually it just keeps coming back, but it's
Well, when do you hit anthesis?
well, at the moment, we'd sort of hardly get in winters. So you get this very strange phasing going on.
So it's not ripening at the same time?
No. Well, it depends where you are, though. It can be extremely bioregional.
Uh-huh.
But you saying
I
that
don't.
generally where you are gets really cold of a winter.
It gets really cold. The bigger issue is that the rye won't lay down after it's crimped unless it has produced pollen and has really moved into the reproductive phase of its life cycle and has a brittle, hollow stem.
Yeah, yeah,
At that point, when you crimp it, it'll stay down.
yeah.
But for us, um, so it's less that part that's a problem. It's more that if you want rye that's 6 feet tall and is going to be so thick that it suppresses the weeds all season long, you really need to plant it in the first week of September. But no one can plant it in the first week of September because your fields are still full of the things that you grow for a living. So
Right.
we tend to plant it later in September or in October or even in November. And at that point, we don't get rye that's very vigorous in the spring. I mean, it grows, but it doesn't get tall enough and tiller enough to actually create that weed suppressive mat all season long. And so the hope for us is that by incorporating clover into it in the early spring or late winter, we can um, have less rye residue. We're not so worried about what the stand of rye looks like anymore because the rye is going to lay down on top of the clover and the clover is going to slowly creep up through it, occupy those spaces that would otherwise be occupied by weeds, and at the same time, not provide as much competition to the cash crop as the cash crop is getting started. So
And
anyway, I have no results. No results. I have a couple like interesting anecdotal data points at this point, but at the end of this year, we'll have a number of trials looking at exactly this
we will have
question.
to ask you back.
I'll love to share it. Um, all right, the last piece here that we're sort of exploring is biology. So we started with Dutch white clover because it's commercially available here in large quantities and it's low growing, so it doesn't provide photosynthetic competition. It's relatively shallow rooted, so a cash crop can operate competition free at lower levels of the soil. But and I believe most of these seeds are bred in the UK still is Aberlasting clover and Aber Ace. Um, both of these are crossed with Cora, which is a more persistent variety than Dutch White. Dutch White is quite persistent for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then for us, it generally gets invaded by perennial grasses. And so you walk out around your field one spring and you think, oh, this looks a lot like a hayfield with a tremendous amount of clover in it. And the Cora clover is slower to establish. They love it in university settings, but farmers hate it because it takes 2 years to establish. So you're taking a field out of production for 2 years. It's basically a non-starter. What they've done is they've crossed the Dutch White with the Cora to get this Aberlasting, and we don't know. Again, we've just started seeding some of it last year, and we don't really have any results yet, but it may be that it's more persistent. It could do a better job suppressing weeds all season long, and it could just stay pure for more years. And there's also Aber Ace, which is a very low growing variety, and that's new to me. And then beyond that is all these micro clovers, and I've only played with them a tiny bit. They've not been robust enough to suppress weeds, but there are so many varieties out there, and I do know people who like them for different purposes, mostly for sod and turf purposes. But that's a whole nother world to explore just
Just
within white
quickly
clover.
ask, is it easy to get the seed from where you are for these different varieties?
So the
I'm hoping Lincoln will come back any second now.
um
Sorry,
and
Lincoln, you froze there for a sec. I just asked the question about supplying the seeds, and you were just about to answer.
sorry. Um so for the Dutch White, um it is widely available. I think that Kent is roughly equivalent. Is that am I right to say that Kent is available in the UK, kind of widely available? You can get it in larger quantities.
I don't know. Our audience probably know. You've had many thanks right the way across. Ian has said, thank you. Great resilience work. Very thought provoking. I'm in. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'll show you my last slide there. If anyone wants to email me um, with questions, that would be great. I am happy to provide more nitty-gritty um, information to somebody who wants to run a trial on their farm. I don't know that I can pay you. None of my grants are international, but I'm super happy to give my time in exchange for some photos, you know, to keep me informed about how it's going so that I can share that information with our farmers and
That'd
yeah.
be brilliant. I'd really like us to keep in touch. And if any of our audience members want to share their stories, do let me know at the OGA. We will have the Organic Grower magazine. There won't be a summer issue. There will be an early autumn or late summer one to coincide with the Organic Growers gathering. So I think Phil's deadline for content will be 15th of July. So if you've got anything you want to share, do share with us. And also, if you're interested in keeping in touch with Lincoln, let us know. I think it'd be really interesting, Lincoln, to have that sort of not just cross Atlantic, but that cross sort of different experience conversation. Well, we observed this. Well, that's interesting because it was like this, but slightly different for us. I think that's useful.
I would love it. Yeah, that sounds great. This is information about the PGC project in Iowa here. For those of you who haven't seen the innovative farmers work with small grains, there's a link there. And this is a webinar I did a couple weeks ago that goes for those of you who are real soil health nerds. It's like 2 hours about soil health outcomes in CLM. Yeah, I think we're good and we're right on time. I'm happy to stick around if there's other
That's
uh
great. No, thank you. Yeah, do ask if anybody's got another question.
oh, Mark's asking for the slide deck. I shared it with you.
Yeah, so Lizzie will have that.
And so yeah, hopefully that can go up.
Yeah, okay. So I'll ask Lizzie, our development officer, and she'll handle that.
Yeah, and Joe is asking the link for the soil health outcomes. These are links, so if you look at
So if
the
we've got the slide deck, okay, cool.
you'll be able to click
Yeah.
each one of these is a live link. My website's awful, just so you all don't judge me too harshly. Or it's flashy, but there's not a lot of information there. It's sort of on purpose. It's meant for funders to visit and see what they want to see. Um, and not and it's really not farmer facing at this point. Mostly because our results are still early.
Was a lot of
Wonderful.
love coming in. That's really good. Thank you. Very, very interesting.
Hooray. Wonderful. I appreciate anyone who's willing to sit around at this time of year for an hour and a half and listen to me blab. I know there's a lot going on.
There is a
Um,
lot going on. There is a lot
yeah.
going on. Brilliant.
Um,
Okay. I
wonderful.
think we'll wrap it
Cool.
up.
Sounds good. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it. And yeah, if you can connect me with folks who are interested, I just think it'd be great, as you say, to get more
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, write to us, admin. The address is hello@organicgrowersalliance.org, but you all probably know that. Or get in touch via the website, organicgrowersalliance.org, and we'll see you for the next one, whenever that is. And hopefully we'll see some of you at the Organic Growers Gathering in August. And meanwhile, Lincoln, thank you very, very much.
thank you. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.